Thank you, Dr. Shinod, for organizing this and also for inviting me to be part of it. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Now, the brief given to me is to talk about what political science takes its disciplinary knowledge to be. This is a tough ask, and for at least two main reasons. The typical political scientist goes about her professional activities without asking herself at each step whether what she is doing is actually leading to knowledge or not. So I sense that there is a gap between the way we approach the uh, numerous quotidian disciplinary tasks and the way the epistemologically inclined philosopher is likely to approach them. And I suggest that we try to bridge this gap by talking about disciplinary practices rather than talking about knowledge. The second reason this is difficult is because political science is this sprawling old establishment with at least 5 subdisciplines. Some of them have had or continue to have separate institutional existence. And one of them, which was born right under the roof of political science, no longer needs us. I'm talking about public policy. Public policy guys don't need us any longer. So this is more of nation and its fragments kind of situation. To make very general kind of statements which are valid for all subdisciplines is nearly impossible. So what I like to do is to be selective and specific rather than comprehensive. I'll talk about certain aspirations and attempts in more recent times towards making the study of politics scientific, and the uneasy relationship that the more historical and comparative work within the discipline has had with this scientific tendency. Now, as you can see, this is going to be very different from what the abstract of the lecture says. And the reason is that the abstract was composed, hurriedly sent across, I won't say under duress, but well, it was sent across more than 10 days before the lecture, after which the script changed considerably. So in case you notice any resemblances between the two, just treat them as pure but happy coincidence. Now, I mentioned two difficulties in the beginning. I think there is one more, at least potentially, and it's a smaller difficulty, but it can be irritating, which is the presence of other social sciences and humanities, which in itself is not irritating. But where does sociology or history or economics in political study of politics, where does it end, and where does what political science has to say about politics, where does that begin? That's a tricky question. Now, this situation has come about because first, because there were some American political scientists who borrowed from other social sciences, thinking that that will make their discipline more scientific. Then at a later point, some other political scientists, more sober than the first group, they thought that knowing only about formal institutions is not enough, so they turned to history and sociology to understand the social. And the third is relatively more recent, the influx of post-structuralism, feminism, and all those trends. So because of these three trends, political science today is no longer only about voting behavior or federalism or party system, but it is also about ethnicities, identities, sartorial styles of political leaders, metaphors used by them, and so on and so forth. Are we still talking about political science? I don't want to get bogged down by this question. I'll simply take what I read and teach and discuss with friends and colleagues to be political science, and then try to identify its peculiarities, maybe its modes of reasoning, and that assumes that someone from a different location, with a different orientation, will have very different things to say. Now, the third wave of influences that I talked about just a minute ago, uh, both into political science and social sciences, actually asks some very deep questions to the innate humanism, for want of a better word, to the innate humanism of the discipline, not only to the historical and normative orientations within it, but also to its scientific trends. Because one thing common to the immense diversity of the critical theories which have influenced study of politics is that they all emphasize the theme of precarity of human knowledge. Now, if despite these theories and the insistence on precarity of knowledge, anyone wants to do science, as a large number of political scientists actually do, then how do they do it? What are their challenges? At the most general level, of course, the challenge is, as it has always been, how to extract objective facts out of representations, voices, or viewpoints, which are represented by which come to you through news reports or interviews or autobiographies or whatever. That has always been the challenge for anyone who wants to study political science objectively or scientifically or whatever. So this has been the main problem. But let's get into the specifics. First, the kind of evidence admissible in political science and the problems of definition that arise while collecting data. Now, these are problems which would arise in any empirical study. For example, when Ashutosh Varshney and Steve Wilkinson set out to study communal violence in India, the problems that they faced were the ones that anyone in their place would have. What counts as an instance of communal violence? How to separate stray incidents from riots? Where to get reliable figures on the dead from? These are the problems that they faced, and these are the problems that anyone doing empirical study with an objectivist bent of mind would. A great deal of research depends on government sources, the state being the biggest generator and collector of data. The usability of this data depends on the definitions and classifications or classification scheme adopted by various government departments. If you go to the website of the National Crime Records Bureau, you will notice that the data on crimes across years or decades is not comparable, because in some cases the categories used to classify that data have changed. In December 2021, Minister of State for Home Affairs informed the Parliament that the category of mob lynching and hate crimes had been discontinued because the category, he said, was not well defined, and therefore the data collected under it was not reliable. Now, the problem that this poses for the researcher is, and again, I'm not saying it's unique to the political scientists. There is this, at the most basic level, where do you get the data from? But there is also this more conceptual problem raised in this case by a historian regarding the very use of the term communal, given its colonial origins. Now, to call something ethnic or sectarian instead of communal is to take a decision about how to name it, how to characterize it, because naming is characterizing. This is a question which, of course, is of great relevance to political scientists, but it is more explicitly addressed by philosophers and anthropologists. It's not that we don't care for it, but we just presume that it is someone else's task to address the problem. And the issue of getting your definitions right or your characterizations right becomes crucial in what can be called transition studies. And just for the sake of convenience, calling them transition studies, in presenting analytically a long stretch of past, you need to calibrate it, of course, uh, or slice the temporal stream, identify phases. This brings up again the challenge of definitions and classifications, because you slice those phases, what do you call them? And on what basis do you call them whatever you decide to call them? How to, let me give you an example. What are the characteristics, for example, of an agrarian economy? How do you distinguish proto-industrialization from full-scale industrialization? Is the increase in the circulation of currency uh, its volume, is it an indicator? Can you take it as an indicator of commercial phase of capitalism? Does it necessarily lead to the next phase of capitalism? Now these are questions which need to be answered before you actually present that stretch of historical time. And this is, once you do that, in the process of doing that, you have already analytically presented it. So as you can see, these questions depend on larger theories, which are a kind of common property of all social sciences. From the other direction, so if this is about facts or data at a more bare level, what about modes of reasoning? Again, a great deal can be said, but quickly a couple of things. Uh, the probabilistic reasoning, which is used for predicting election results, is obviously not exclusive to political science, nor are the sampling techniques which are used. They are also fairly standard. But besides election analysis, political scientists also use a lot of history, as we saw a couple of minutes ago in talking about transition studies, or in some cases, they try to do history themselves. Now, when you're trying to do history yourself, there are certain precautions to be taken. And those precautions, again, are fairly usual given by the current historiographical standards. What are they? Avoid strong historicism, avoid grand historical narratives, be skeptical of the idea or the argument that such and such event was bound to occur. Don't look at the past as though it was moving towards the present. Avoid anachronism of categories, etc., etc. More specifically, in trying to construct the past, we are supposed to use the criterion of coherence, because the criterion of correspondence, as far as past is concerned, is not feasible in most of time. It's been argued, and incidentally, this is argued by someone who is talking about forms of legal reasoning, and that just shows how certain forms of reasoning are they sort of get used across disciplines. So this scholar says that the only type of test which we have for verifying contested assertions about the past is the test of coherence, which is taking all that has been presented to us in the way of evidence and knowing what we know about the social world. Is this story, does the story hang together, or is this story more coherent than the competing stories? That's the only criterion that is available to us. Now, this is related to the idea of making past actions, individuals or collectives' actions, intelligible. And this is something that I'll turn to a little later. Political scientists' interest in the past can also be described in terms of different kinds of puzzles that they set out to solve. For uh, for example, they can ask, they can address a puzzle which is a kind of a why question, or they can address a puzzle which is a kind of a how question. So if you're studying, again, to continue with the example of communal violence, if you're studying communal violence in a town, you could either ask why the riot took place, and in choosing to ask the why question, you are explicitly or otherwise assuming that there is something abnormal about the occurrence of the violence, and therefore you're asking the why question. Somehow communal peace is normal, that's an assumption, and that's why you're asking the why question. Or you can ask the how question, how different kinds of enmities, which is part of any social which is part of social life anywhere, how different kinds of enmities got fused over time into communal violence. So you could ask these two different kinds of questions. There are also works which resemble the detectives' investigations, like the question whether Marx indeed wanted to dedicate the first volume of Capital to Darwin, or whether the lectures on education were indeed lectures by Kant and not some mishmash put together by his students. Now, thanks to these investigations, we now know better about the Marx-Darwin connection, and Louis White Beck's work has convinced us that Kant's lectures on education were actually Kant's lectures, and there is no doubt about the fact that the content is very similar to what Kant had to say, both content and style. Now, this sort of inquiry reminds me, at least, of what Carlo Ginzburg, in his very famous essay called Clues, called an evidentiary paradigm. This is not used very often by political scientists, and in fact, of the two examples that I gave, one was not from, institutionally speaking, at least from political science. So this reminds me of what he called the evidentiary paradigm, and those of you who are more logically inclined might want to call it retrodiction, but that's a separate point. Now, I've been giving examples of historical writings for interest in history, but if political scientists are concerned with history in various ways, of course, there are as many or more who are concerned with trends in the present. So take a statement like electoral corruption is the root of all corruption, or prohibition leads to bootlegging. Now, these are statements which are similar to what economists claim to know about the relationship between level of taxation and level of revenues earned, that they both go up and after some time the revenues start declining. These generalizations are time and probably space specific, but they float around as pieces of practical knowledge. And they float around among, they're circulated among administrators, politicians, and students of politics. Their form, marked by the simple present tense, makes you wonder if they are statements of law-like generality and regularity, or at least intended to be. And they may very well be, but they are short summaries of the practical experience that governments or administrators or activists have had. Now, if you move to generalizations of greater and greater temporal depth, their production and circulation tends to get more and more restricted. For example, there is this scholar, James Chinekanda. He has argued that in plural societies like India and Nigeria, electoral politics introduced by the colonial administration decisively mobilized ethnic identities, reinforced existing ethnic divisions, and placed the colonial state in the position of a seemingly neutral arbiter. Or Laia Greenfield's claim about nationalism, that nationalism is the form in which democracy appeared in the world, contained in the idea of the nation as a butterfly in a cocoon. The circle of those who produce and evaluate these claims, or claims of this kind, is far more restricted than the first category. Then there are historical critiques of inquiries about modernity, or the turn to vernaculars in Indian history roughly from 10th century onwards, or the celebrated work on the Mediterranean. These cover long-term trends and epochal changes. The issues dealt with, basically issues normally dealt with by political science, are neither temporally as deep as these, nor are they as shallow as the current affairs would have you believe. And yet the political scientist, as part of his or her training, must learn to handle inquiries of this kind, and that takes up quite a bit of hard work. So we can begin with statements framed in the present tense, and statements which also seem to be relevant in the present for public policy, for example, and then move on to claims with the past of greater and greater temporal depth. Now, arranging claims according to their temporal depth and asking who gets to produce them or validate them would be, I think, a fascinating sociological study or a sociological exercise. But we can't do it here because the mainstream political scientist is more interested in the methodologies of these claims. What kind of methodology allows you to make claims of this kind? So that's what we need to turn to. Of course, historical writings have been and remain important for the discipline. There is the study of the formation of the discipline at Oxford and Cambridge during the 19th century, and that study shows that the two main methods advocated were the historical method and comparative method. Sometimes they went together, sometimes they pulled in different directions. I don't want to go into the details of that study. It's a fascinating study, but I just want to emphasize that those who were pushing for courses on historical and comparative method, they saw history and comparative method as essentially inductive in nature. Let me quote J.S. Mill towards the end of 19th century, 1867 to be precise. He says, all true political science is, in one sense of the phrase, a priori. Now let this word a priori not mislead us, because if you see the rest of the quotation, you will see that he's actually talking about induction, or rather induction, and both induction and deduction are at work, as they are indeed at work in the well-known hypothetico-deductive method. So here is what he says. All true political science is, in one sense of the phrase, a priori, being deduced from the tendencies of things, tendencies known either through our general experience of human nature or as a result of an analysis of the course of history considered as progressive evolution. So as Martin Hollis very astutely pointed out, the celebrated hypothetico-deductive method is more of the most of the important job in that procedure is done by induction. It's only after induction has given you certain generalizations that the deductive inference comes in. Anyway, so this was at Oxford and Cambridge, but historical and comparative works have remained important even in the later phase of the discipline elsewhere also. Our engagement, that is our disciplinary engagement with history, basically takes two or three forms depending on the methodological goals. For example, it can be either a one-nation study or a cross-nation study. Francine Frankel's work is a good example, read by political science students and teachers alike. Whereas it's an example of one nation study, whereas you have the Harvard scholar Theda Skocpol's work, which is an example of across cases kind of study. Now, let me very quickly tell you what Frankel is doing. Not that the content is very important for our purposes. Francine Frankel's what she is doing is she is examining the strategy adopted by the political class in the 50s in India, the strategy of aiming at radical economic transformation without a great deal of disruption or without a great deal of disruptive violence. So she's asking, was the strategy of combining political gradualism with intended radical economic transformation, was it successful? And of course, her answer is that it did not succeed in attacking the problem of mass poverty. So that's basically the thesis. Of course, it's a long book. The second edition runs into more than 800 pages. So it's impossible to give you the sense of what the study is more than giving just this very short summary. Right, so as I said, it's a one-nation study, and its goal is not to arrive at generalizations which are valid for all developing countries, but to explain the limited success of India's growth story through a detailed account of the interaction between the political and economic forces. She was very aware of the earlier 10-nation study by Gunnar Myrdal, but what she takes from Myrdal is the importance of institutions and not comparative dimension as such. That institutions are important, and in the absence of institutions, the right kind of institutions, investments will not mere investments will not lead to more investments. That's what she was trying to say. Coming to Theda Skocpol's work on revolutions, it's a good example of the and of course a very celebrated example of the comparative variety, as was the work done by her teacher at Harvard, Barrington Moore. If the intent and upshot of Frankel's work is to evaluate a course of political and economic measures in terms of their declared goals in one country, then Skocpol's interest was to identify the different causal paths that lead to similar results in different places. She reconstructs the historical sequence in terms of actions, events, and conditions. I'm using the word conditions here in the sense of states of affair, which make the occurrence of certain types of events more likely than other types of events. That's the sense in which I'm using the word conditions. So all these actions, events, and conditions, in terms of these, she reconstructs the historical sequence, and the occurrence of uh, uh, those combinations of factors which led to revolutions in different places. There is a diagram which is constructed by someone else, another scholar, using Skocpol's work, which shows the causality in fairly accessible form. So there are some 31 causes which are divided into 4 clusters, each cluster leading to the next cluster of causes and eventually to the revolution, which is here in this work identified as breakdown of the state. The breakdown of the state itself is a composite of 6 causal events. It is analytically interesting that the first cluster is made up of conditions. What are those conditions? Like tax system discouraging agricultural innovation, or agriculture remaining backward, trends like population growth, etc., etc. Whereas the last cluster is mainly of events. So if the causality in the first cluster is between conditions, then the causality in the last cluster is between events. You might wonder why this is so, and just quickly in passing, the reason is because she was looking at revolutionary change in terms of a combination of A, conditions, and B, uh, condition and action coming together of a breakdown, and a class willing to move in and take advantage of the breakdown of the state. And that is why you have this distinction between causality among states and causality among events. If what we are studying is not one big event like revolution, which is of course a composite event, but a recurrent phenomenon, then comparing places where it occurs with those where it doesn't, at least not with the same frequency, becomes an obvious choice. So once again, the analytical resources for this kind of exercise are provided by philosophy. In this case, they come from John Stuart Mill. If you want to know why certain cities are prone to communal violence, you take two cities similar to each other in most respects, except that in one city there is high incidence of communal violence, and in the other city there is very low incidence of communal violence. And then you say that there is this one factor, which the presence of which explains why there is low incidence in one city, and the absence of that factor lets other factors work their potency, and that results in communal violence. So this is the celebrated method of difference from John Stuart Mill, though it seems Mill himself was skeptical of extension of this method to the human or social affairs. Now, you will have noticed that in all these different kinds of historical studies, it is the causal processes and the possibility of generalization which the scientist in the political scientist is interested in. This is where we come to the slightly technical part of this talk. Now, I know that afternoon is not a great time for technical discussion, but it's unavoidable. So let's quickly do it and try and do it as painlessly as possible. So there are causes, there are correlations, there are causes understood as both necessary and sufficient conditions, and there are causes understood as only sufficient conditions. Now, at this point, you have, or the political scientist who wants to do a study of this kind has mainly two options, which with some risk of misunderstanding can be called the quantitative and qualitative. Now, by qualitative, I do not mean either descriptive or interpretative. Uh, so that's the standard dichotomy or opposition between positivism and hermeneutics is not what I have in mind here. Both these approaches, quantitative and qualitative, belong to explanatory stream of political studies. They both believe that to explain is to demonstrate the causality at work, and they both subscribe to the what is called as covering law model. So why do we then call one side quantitative? Because they use statistics. Why do we call the other side qualitative? Because basically it is logic and set theory which is at work here. The qualitative kind of political science, the quantitative, the statistical types, the quantitative kind of political scientist would actually ideally prefer to set up experiments uh, instead of relying on the unreliable data provided by others, governments or whoever. So there is a quotation by someone who uses this method. It is when a science starts to go out and ask what it wants to know rather than relying on information collected for other purposes that it begins to take control of its growth. The ability to get at causation is, after all, the main advantage of experimentation, an advantage that no other methodology can offer. And this is what experimentation does. Now, we all know the problems with use of experimentation in social or human sciences. The tendency of the self-fulfilling and self-falsifying tendencies of theory, human social theories come into play, particularly in the form of what is called as the Hawthorne effect, which is subjects changing their behavior because they recognize that they are being observed. And this limits the validity and generalizability of the findings of experiment. There are also ethical concerns regarding privacy, etc. So if there are no experiments that you can easily set up in human social sciences, then what do? The next best option is natural experiments. The word natural here is again very, very misleading. It's nothing to do with Mother Nature. Natural experiments are observational studies in which some exogenous process assigns members of a particular population, the population that you are interested in, to different groups. And since it is done by the exogenous process, it is as good as random distribution of these members of the population to two almost identical groups, and that in a way nicely sets up as an experimental situation. Suppose we want to know whether this is fortuitous, but it works. Suppose we want to know whether exposure to Western media increases disaffection with the authoritarian regime at home, and we go and ask the dissident groups. Now that's not going to help, because the dissident groups, already disaffected with their regime for other reasons, are more likely to be listening to BBC or Voice of America or whatever. So what we do is, and this is what a particular study, to get around this problem, what they did was they took advantage of the fact that the West German television was not available for purely technological and topographical reasons in some parts of East Germany, like the Dresden district. Whereas in other parts of East Germany, it was available. People were watching it, and the authorities knew about it. So now what you have is people living under the same regime, divided into those who are exposed purely for technological reasons, not through human contrivance, to exposed to the West German television, and those who are not. And then they did a survey and tried to find out their political attitudes towards their own regime. Now, the results of the experiment were, of course, very, very surprising and very counterintuitive. They found that those who were exposed to the West German television actually supported their own regime more than those who were not. And then there were, of course, explanations why this must happen. So this is an example. So what I call the technological inability of those towers to telecast in all parts of West Germany, and the topographical regions. This offered a nice fortuitous situation to find out if there was any causal connection between those two factors. Now, if you don't have natural experiments, because you have to wait for fortuitous things to happen, for the randomness to occur, If you don't have that, then what do? The next best for the quantitative type again is experiments. If there are no experiments, then you turn to statistical generalizations. Statistical generalizations based on survey data. These are known as large n first number, large n studies. The small n studies of the kind that Skocpol did are regarded by the quantitative types as inferior, because there is no scope for generalization there. How can you generalize on the basis of just 3 or 4 revolutions? And if you can't generalize, then what's the point of studying them? That's the argument. The response from the so-called qualitative side is that the issue is not whether to generalize or not, but what the conception of cause is. And this is where an interesting distinction between the qualitative and quantitative types emerges. The difference can be put as that between causes of effects approach and the effects of causes approach. Now, this like the famous Isaiah Berlin distinction between freedom from freedom to. Initially, you think these are two, both are the same. They're just two ways of saying the same thing, and then you realize there is actually a big difference. Similarly, there's a big difference between the approach which looks for causes of effects, which means that the effects have already occurred and you're tracing back the causality, and the approach or studies which try to look for effects of causes. The research goal of the small number comparison is to explain particular outcomes, whereas for those working in the statistical tradition is the research goal is to estimate average effects of a certain cause in a population. The Skocpol study that I mentioned earlier belongs, of course, to the causes of effects approach. The effect, namely the revolution, has already occurred, and you want to trace the causality behind it. Some statements like voters tend to vote differently in assembly elections from the way they vote in parliamentary elections, provided that such and such factor is present, belongs to effects of causes kind of studies. If there is a research question, what causes democracy? Then the qualitative types will understand the question as what brought about transition to democracy in these 2 or 3 societies or these 2 or 3 cases. Qualitative researchers will pose the question differently. What is the average causal effect of one or more independent variables on democracy, defined in suitable operational terms? So the point I'm trying to get at is that researchers translate a question into a question according to the norms of their research culture. So when they have done that, they are no longer asking the same question. That's the point that I'm trying to get at. The Sarah Skocpol's kind of historical study typically works with multiple causation, and the INUS model, with its emphasis on sufficiency of different combinations of causal factors, is ideally suited, is congenial to formalize what Skocpol was doing. The situation is quite different for the on the quantitative statistical side. Here, the analyst typically seeks to identify causes that, on average, affect, that is, increase or decrease the values on an outcome across a large population. So, for convenience, let us call this a correlational approach to causes, which is a characterization that they will furiously disown. Now, the difference between causation and correlation, I assume that everyone knows, so I'm just jogging your memory. Elster says, John Elster, who's done a lot of work, says that correlation is not causation. What we need is a causal mechanism that will connect cause with effect. Therefore, statistical generalizations do not explain. That's the argument that he's firing at the quantitative side. It may be statistically true that citizens in democracies live longer than citizens in non-democratic regimes, but does it mean that the nature of the regime explains the fact of longevity? Not unless we have taken care of, in the sense of controlling all the factors that might be the cause of longevity. If it is true that democracies tend to be more industrialized than non-democracies, then there might be a causal connection there, and something which the statistical generalization will be unable to specify. Uh, and this importance, the importance of mechanism for full understanding of causality, is emphasized by another scholar who also works, broadly speaking, in the explanatory tradition, but he understands the idea of mechanism somewhat differently. His name is Charles Tilly, and we'll come to a quotation from him in a minute. There is a side story here. Uh, the side story is that of rational choice theory. Elster identifies the rationality as the mechanism in case of rational choice by individuals. He proposes the rationality of agent as a mechanism that can connect a choice situation of the agent with the choice made by the agent in a causal manner through a hypothetical imperative. If X is the best means to achieve Y, then choose X. That's the hypothetical imperative. I spoke of making the past intelligible earlier in my lecture, and this is one way in which you can do it. The paradigm mode of, and I'm quoting, the paradigm mode of explaining action is to demonstrate that it was performed because it was rational. It is not enough to show that the action chosen had good consequences for the agent and therefore it was rational. No, it must be understood as optimal from the agent's point of view. So he says that the conception of rationality that he's working with is through and through subjective. Whereas Weber at one place, and this is quoted by Elster, seems to be operating with an objective notion of rationality in trying to make sense of actions of the agents. So here is the quotation, a short one. In analyzing a political or military campaign, it is convenient to determine in the first place what would have been a rational choice for that particular actor given the end or ends of those actors or participants and adequate knowledge of all circumstances. He's saying adequate, he's not saying optimal. Only in this way is it possible to assess the causal significance of irrational factors which account for deviation from the rational choice or rational action. And then you have Karl Popper, who developed a similar position, and he called it situational logic, and presented it at various places, including his lecture, very well-known lecture at Tübingen. Uh, he says, if we were to explain the actions of Napoleon at a particular juncture, we put together all the facts about his goals, about his motives, the knowledge he had by, uh, and once we do that, what we have is an objective situation, which is something that we have reconstructed. And then we deduce his course of action by showing how it was rational for an actor who was in that kind of situation to act the way that he did. And he says this is of course a rational reconstruction, and therefore it is only an approximation to the truth, but it's a very good approximation. So you have here three important figures. There are differences in their positions, Elster, Weber, and Popper, but the common area seems to be you seek empirical and empirically criticizable explanations of the actions of individuals, and please note individuals or aggregates of individuals, because these are all methodological individualists. You seek empirical and empirically criticizable explanations of the actions of individuals who can be assumed to be rational in the sense of instrumental rationality by deducing their actions from a reconstructed objective situation. If you do this successfully, then you will have answered the why question. And several such answers can help us progress towards generalizing regarding human behavior. We render human behavior intelligible by subsuming parts of these explanations under ever wider generalizations. The paradigm of explanation which is used here is again the hypothetico-deductive method. This program, which I very in a brutally summarized fashion presented to you, was drawn long back. But the political scientists have not been able to make political action intelligible in terms of these law-like generalizations. Charles Tilly and John Elster, both veterans of scientific research, have this to say. As represented by the manuals, course outlines, presidential addresses, approved political science doctrine generally favors some combination of propensity and covering law explanations. So, to explain political action means to reconstruct accurately the state of an actor at the point of action, and to locate the state as a special case of a general law concerning human nature or human behavior. Such a doctrine, and this is important, such a doctrine rests on an implausible claim that ultimately all political processes result from from extremely general uniformities in the human nature or in propensities of human nature, especially individual actors. Despite more than a century of strenuous effort, political scientists have not been able to secure very many such uniformities. That was Charles Tilly in 2001, not very long ago. And here is Elster in 2007. I'm giving you the dates because you might say, but in last 50 years or 30 years, there must have been a lot of progress on this count. I now believe that this is Elster, the champion of rational choice theory, and has done a great deal to explain very, very lucidly the logic of rational choice explanation. I now believe that rational choice theory has less explanatory power than I used to think. Do real people act on calculations that make up many pages of mathematical calculations in leading journals? I do not think so. And then he goes on to say, rational choice explanations of complex phenomena are empirically weak or controversial. Deterministic laws of the kind in physics and chemistry, where, and I don't know if this is true, I'm just taking his word for it, determinist laws of this kind in physics and chemistry, where given the antecedents, only one consequent is possible, are hardly available or possible in social sciences. There simply are very few well-established general or universal laws in the social sciences. That's Elster. Now, I don't want to use these candid admissions by the veterans of explanatory political science to declare finally the futility of the explanatory model of political science. That would be both too easy and too quick. Declare futility of explanatory model and then rush headlong towards the hermeneutic camp. No, I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to ask what happens to our understanding of the socio-political world when we adopt this explanatory model. That I think is a more important question to ask. Now, remember, talking about politics is not the monopoly of political scientists. In fact, politics is one of the three great obsessions in urban India: films and cricket, or films and football, maybe being the other two. The belief that everyone has the competence to comment on politics is so widely held that sometimes people are surprised to find that some of us get paid for teaching politics to students. There are also sites and forms in which politics gets discussed. Let's quickly look at them, and this cannot be an exhaustive list. At tea shops, speeches made by the politicians, television talk shows or discussions, or what passes for discussion, administrators' deliberations, fact-finding committees of all kinds, classrooms, scholarly works, etc., etc. What we come to know under the conditions of, let's say, an experiment, or the conditions of counseling, or the conditions of interrogation, or the conditions of a friendly conversation, is in each case different, or has a different, if you want to use that word, epistemological status. I suppose it needs no elaborate argument to claim that the institutional and cultural form in which a discourse takes place heavily influences its shape and its content and what it means for those who engage in it. For example, the very nature of facts changes depending on whether it is a conversation over endless cups of tea among friends, or whether it is something like the testimonies and Truth and Reconciliation Commission, out of which those facts are emerged. So this is something that I suppose all of you will agree with. Now we can extend this insight to the so-called knowledge produced by explanatory science of politics. And again, very quickly, let me give you four examples. When the American political scientists wanted to find out through rigorous value neutral empirical study whether power was distributed widely or monopolized in American cities, they needed an operational definition of power. They defined it in such a way, they of course defined it suitable for their purposes, for their empirical investigation, but they defined it in such a way that they excluded some very important aspects. There is some very important dimensions of power which they knew existed, but which could not be rendered measurable, which could not be drawn into the net of their empirical investigations. So methodology was more important for them than a rich or more plausible conception of power. In the process, what they gave us was maybe a rigorous methodological empirical work, but ultimately an impoverished notion of power. Then Olson, whose work Logic of Collective, old work, Logic of Collective Action, it tries to show that the free rider phenomenon makes it difficult to get everyone in a group to work voluntarily for the common cause if the common cause is what the economists call public good, which is non-exclusive. You can't exclude anybody from enjoying that public good. He says, indeed, unless the number of individuals in a group is quite small, or unless there is coercion or some other special device used to make individuals act in their common interest, rational, self-interested individuals in a group will not act to achieve the common or group interests. Now, I have two comments on this. One, given the rational choice, methodological individualism kind of starting point of this study, this conclusion is in a way anyway foreshadowed by that starting point. But more importantly, the attractiveness of this formulation, if there is any, is compromised by the exclusion of what we might call drawing upon the distinction between common goods and convergent goods. The attractiveness of this formulation depends on excluding from the study consideration of convergent goods, which by definition are both achieved and enjoyed together. If they are not enjoyed and achieved together, then they are not convergent goods. That's what they are by definition. So by using the idea of commonness as something which is restricted to non-convergent goods, Olson is able to give you a very attractive formulation. The third is John Harsanyi, who's contributed a lot to rational choice thinking. He tries to show in a very old and very interesting article in the journal called Mind how moral imperatives like the Kantian categorical imperative can be seen as non-causal hypothetical imperatives. And you can see why he's doing it, because once you can convert them into hypothetical imperatives, they start looking like they can be assimilated into rational choice theory. Moral rules, he says, moral rules are in actual fact. That's the word he's saying, using. He's not saying they are like. Moral rules are in actual fact hypothetical imperatives. The argument again may be interesting or persuasive for some people, but the conception of morality that he's working with is morality as merely rule following. It's not even a full-blown Kantian position. And finally, the situational logic of Popper, which he says can make actions intelligible. The conception of intelligibility here again is restrictive, as you must have noticed. Intelligible means that which can be successfully deduced from a reconstructed situation of the rational, presumably rational actor. And there hangs a tail, because between economics and, let's say, rational choice of John Elster's kind, the status of that rationality, whether it is an assumption, methodologically important assumption, which however yields very good predictions, or whether it is a statement of actual fact, that's the difference between the two. But we don't need to get into that. So the larger point I'm trying to make is a form of intellectual activity called science talks about power, or it talks about collective action, or it talks about rendering human action intelligible. When it does that, these concepts like power or action or intelligibility for that matter get pre-shrunk, as it were, to borrow an expression. Now, there is no harm in it if it is only one of the many ways of talking about power or collective action or intelligibility, and not the supreme or supposedly the best way. But such is the lure and prestige of the explanatory and predictive model anywhere or everywhere, that the inability of this model to take on full-blooded complex notions in fact becomes its strength and influences the circulation of those concepts in the extra scientific discourse as well. Something of this sort, I suspect, happened to intelligence. They needed a concept of intelligence which was measurable, and they came up with a concept of intelligence which was measurable, uh, with the result that outside those experiments and outside those studies also everyone started using the notion of intelligence which is measured. So intelligence became necessarily that which is measurable. Now, I've said this, and I'll say it again, that I don't view the search for uniformities in human affairs as either impossible or as always undesirable. Uh, but I do resent this kind of knowledge claiming sovereignty. That's what I think the problem is. When a political scientist points out, for example, the oddity of the display of weapons in a Republic Day parade, what she is doing is that she is reminding us why we celebrate Republic Day in the first place, and how, for the significance that the Republic Day has for us, how the display of weapons on that day is anomalous. Or when a historian tells us how certain communities uh, came to be called the martial races, he helps us understand the origins of our stereotypes. Or when a political philosopher tells us that in order to love democracy well, you need to love it moderately. When he says that, he forces us to reflect on the claims that other values have on us. Now, all these activities, like restoring the significance of a particular celebration or proposing a new balance of our values, are practices just as promising or warning the kind of practices that speech act theorists talked about were practices. If, as the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor argues, theory is not only about practices, but it is also partly constitutive of practices that the theory tries to talk about, then the theory practice relationship in social sciences is very different from the relationship between a scientific theory and the phenomenon or the object that it is trying to capture through law like generalizations. We need a conception of knowledge besides knowledge as a set of law like statements. Uh, Law like statements, of course, about the uniformities in social political world, because explanatory science, in trying to provide knowledge of the world, is in danger of impoverishing our understanding of it rather than illuminating it. We may need this kind of knowledge, that is the knowledge given by explanatory kind of social science. We may need it for certain purposes, but in the absence of other forms of intellectual engagement with the world, and indeed effective in engagements with the world, we will not even know if and when the explanatory kind of science has overstepped its limits. That's the fairly modest, but I hope non-trivial argument or claim that I want to make. So thank you very much for your patience.